This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50. This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for Tuesday, August 22nd, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi everyone.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to explore whether average female and male interests differ. And then Christina is going to look into whether laughter is really the best medicine. But first to Pat, who will explore glyphosate in food.
We got the following message. I was just sent a link regarding a report which seems to show alarmingly high parts per million of glyphosate in many products I consume. Is this report legit? Thanks, avid listener Ian. And he gives a link to the report. All right, what is glyphosate? It's the most widely used herbicide by volume in the world, and it's the main ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup.
Oh no!
The debate about the chemical's possible harm to humans and the environment has been going on for decades. The potential influence of large companies like Monsanto on regulatory agencies like the FDA to suppress negative studies is often part of that discussion. I'm not going to dive into that world here. Adam did a segment on some of the claims against Monsanto on episode 217, if you want to go have a listen to that. I'll stick mostly to Ian's question on whether this report is legit. The report he sent us got a whole bunch of attention when in November 2016, Vannie Harry, more commonly known as Food Babe, wrote about it on her very popular blog. She also posts about it to her more than 1 million followers on Facebook about once a week. At the time that I was doing research for this segment, she had just posted the following. Share with a friend who eats these foods. An FDA-registered food safety laboratory tested iconic American food for residues of the weed killer glyphosate, aka Monsanto's Roundup, and found alarming, all caps, amounts. Just to give you an idea of how much, independent research shows that harm to human health can begin at really low levels of exposure, like only 0.1 parts per billion of glyphosate.
Whoa.
Yet many foods tested were found to have over 1,000 times this amount. So the attention that this sort of post generated is likely why the report made it to your inbox, Ian. There are a few parts to this, and we can start with, is the testing legit? The answer is sort of, kind of. The testing was carried out by Resco Laboratories, and they are an FDA-registered food inspection laboratory, but there's been no peer review of their findings.
I think it might be worth specifying that doesn't mean that the FDA did it. It only means the lab is FDA approved.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely true.
Okay.
Another issue is that many of the results they reported are actually marked with an asterisk. The asterisk denotes the following, quote, the above amounts found are rough estimates at best and may not represent an accurate representation of the sample. So we've got a problem with the data. The other thing to mention is that while the testing was carried out by Resco, the report itself was produced by an activist food group called Food Democracy Now! And a research group called the Detox Project. The strong wording and alarmist tone of the report is theirs, and both these groups clearly have an agenda. So the next question is glyphosate safe? Regulatory agencies have been going back and forth on its safety ever since it was registered, but in a nutshell, the current state is this. There is limited evidence human cancer risks might increase as a result of exposure to very large amounts of glyphosate. The National Pesticide Information Center, which is a collaboration between Ohio State University and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, points out right on their homepage that some studies suggest glyphosate has carcinogenic potential and that studies on cancer rates in people have provided conflicting results. But the scientific consensus seems to be that there is no good evidence of such a risk from typical usage, such as in domestic gardening. For example, a 2016 joint meeting of the United Nations Panel of Experts on Pesticide Residues in Food and the Environment and the World Health Organization Core Assessment Group on Pesticide Residues concluded that, based on the available evidence, quote, glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic risk to humans from exposure through diet. Okay, last thing. Food Babe states, harm to human health can begin at really low levels of exposure, like only 0.1 parts per billion. In contrast, the reference dose in the US, or estimate of daily exposure that would not cause adverse effects, is 1.75 milligrams per kilogram per day. So for me, I'm 6 feet tall, I'm 180 pounds, that's 142 milligrams of glyphosate every day of my life. The biggest number in this report is Cheerios cereal at 1,125 parts per billion. Now, presumably they use parts per billion because it sounds scarier than 1 part per million.
Yeah.
But let's put that into perspective. So pro-science blogger The Credible Hulk did some math using a hypothetical produce that had glyphosate residue 5 times what was supposedly found in Cheerios, or 5 parts per million. By his calculation, a person weighing 154 pounds would need to eat 62 pounds of that produce a day, every day, to exceed the reference dose. Again, that's at 5 times the residue that was supposedly found in this report's largest parts per billion measurement. All right, Ian. I expect that the discussion and controversy around glyphosate will continue, and we may even get a bit of heat for covering this if the comments in the Credible Hulk's blog is any indication. But regarding this particular report, we have problems with the data. We've got no peer review of the findings. The research was paid for by folks with a clear agenda, and they are the ones who wrote and released an alarmist report. And then we have regulatory bodies telling us that based on current evidence, there's nothing to worry about. Thanks for the question.
Sounds like the old saying that the poison is in the dose really applies here. There's a lot of bad stuff in almost anything that we eat.
Yep.
But you don't really have to worry about it if it's so trace that it really has no effect on your body.
Water will kill you if you drink too much of it.
It's true. I often think about people being misguided or naive with these sort of reports and then latching on to fear. Now I'm wondering if there's people who actually like short this stuff in the stock market when there's reports. Like, yeah, glyphosate is down 10 cents and I just made $1 million. Write in if you know anything about this.
I mean, the mere mention of Monsanto or Roundup is going to start something, right?
Yeah, it's true. And if you're looking for an antidote to Food Babe's antics, you can check out SciBabe.com.
Great website.
Given that the description of our show is to explore controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking, it seemed reasonable to explore one of the claims made in James Damore's now infamous Google memo. Clearly, the memo provokes strong reactions, and it is understandable that various people are upset about it, so it is with delicacy that I explore any of it at all. I tend to think that if we only apply critical thinking when it's easy, we really aren't living up to the purpose of the podcast. The claim I've chosen to explore is whether there are population-level differences in the interests of men and women, not their ability. Given the difficulty of decent discourse on the memo's content, I wanted to examine one of the more testable claims that has evidence to refute or support it. Note, I'm primarily looking at whether this difference exists, not why it exists. I'm looking at populations, not individuals. Treating individuals as if they are representative of the average of a population is flawed thinking and should be avoided. Additionally, in case it needs to be highlighted, I think sexism is a large problem in our society and pervasive in many sectors, including tech. How do people go about researching differences among men and women? Quoting Sue et al., quote, "The interest model developed by Holland, 1959-1997, is the most widely adopted theoretical framework for interest measurement. Holland organized vocational interest into 6 types, forming a circular structure referred to collectively as RISEC. Picture a hexagon. So it's not quite a circle, but it can be depending on how those points deviate from the center.
Depends how much you squint, you know?
Yes. You combine a lot of them, you get a nice little honeycomb. RISEC is an acronym with each letter standing for a different category. Starts with R, being realistic, which is interest in working with things and gadgets or working outdoors. The I is investigative, which is an interest in science, including mathematics, physical and social sciences, and biological and medical sciences. The A stands for artistic, which is interest in creative expression, including writing and the visual and performing arts, social interest in helping people. The E is enterprising, interest in working in leadership or persuasive roles directed at achieving economic objectives. And the C is conventional, interest in working in well-structured environments, especially business settings. Prediger, 1982, proposed two bipolar work task dimensions underlying Holland's hexagon: working with things versus people, and working with data versus ideas. In general, this 6-factor RISEC framework has led to super factors, often now known as the larger category of people and things. So there's a people-things dimension, or people versus things, and you can categorize these things in useful ways statistically and even conceptually. Now, meta-analyses are better than any single study, as they allow a broader look at an area of inquiry. In the words of Stevens and Haidt, it is, quote, a method of examining the effects found, or not found, in dozens or hundreds of studies, converting the effect sizes to a common scale, and then finding the average across all the studies. And this is still the quote, although meta-analysis is a powerful technique, it is not perfect. Statistically significant findings are much more likely to be published and thus included in meta-analyses compared to null findings which often remain unpublished. End quote. Thus, they indicate it is impossible for any meta-analysis to obtain all the relevant data on a particular topic because some of that is unpublished. Stevens and Haidt have collected various meta-analyses related to some of the topics in the Google memo, and I use their collection later in the segment. I recommend you read their piece at trcpodcast.com. Returning briefly to that line about converting effect sizes to a common scale, I thought it useful to remind people what effect sizes are. Many times a published paper will talk about the p-value, which is often used, for good or bad, to determine whether something is statistically significant. The more significant the finding, the more likely it is that something is actually happening in the world. That's what we're trying to do with stats. That said, the p-value does not tell you about the size of the effect. So something could be really statistically significant, but without other information, you have no idea if the difference is very small, large, or somewhere in between. For many psychology findings, effect size is measured by Cohen's d, which is defined as the difference between two means divided by the standard deviation for the data. So one mean minus the other one divided by standard deviation. As you can imagine, it gets much more complicated with variations on this theme for different types of data and different types of stats, but that's the high-level gist. A Cohen's d of 0.2 is small, 0.5 is medium, 0.8 is large, and over 1 is thought to be very large, in general. All that to say, a good meta-analysis will be able to convert all the effect sizes in all of the papers to a common scale so they can be meaningfully compared. Lots of qualifications, but now some data. Sue, Rounds, and Armstrong in 2009 published a paper called Men and Things, Women and People, a Meta-Analysis of Sex Differences and Interests. And they did indeed do one. They used technical manuals for 47 interest inventories. This yielded 503,000 respondents. Although I read through the paper, the abstract has a nice summary. Quote, results show that men prefer working with things and women prefer working with people, producing a large effect size, Cohen's d 0.93, on the things people dimension. Men showed stronger realistic d 0.84 and investigative d 0.26 interests, and women showed stronger artistic d 0.35, social d 0.68, and conventional d 0.33 interests. Sex differences favoring men were also found for more specific measures of engineering, d 1.11, science d 0.36, and mathematics d 0.34 interests, as they also looked at some of the STEM variables. Based on Sue et al.'s meta-analyses, we can say that research indicates that there is a difference between the interests of men and women, on average, with men relative to women showing a greater interest in things compared to people, and that this effect size is large. This finding is consistent with another meta-analysis, LIPA RA in 2010, looking at gender differences in personality and interests, when, where, and why. That found that gender differences on the people-things dimension of interest was very large, d 1.18, with women more people-oriented and less thing-oriented than men. Note, this includes the Sue meta-analysis I just mentioned, so you're wondering if that's sort of double counting. But there are other two studies involved actually had higher Ds, one at 1.4 and one at 1.29. Now, one of them had 200,000 data points in terms of people, and the other one had 2,000. So you can weight those things a bit differently.
Yep.
This difference is also consistent with another meta-analysis, Morris in 2016, Vocational Interests in the United States, Sex, Age, Ethnicity, and Year Effects. And this is from their abstract. In summation, on average, there are consistent and large differences between the interests of men and women, where men show a relative preference for things over people. Reminder, of course, differences within groups are often larger than between groups. Now, why might men and women have different interests? That is something I'll have to leave for the listener to explore, as I'm going to be soon out of time. But the main competing hypotheses are that it's primarily due to how little boys and girls are raised differently to conform to gender roles, or that the difference in interest is primarily due to genetic and evolved factors. The truth is often somewhere in the middle, but it's hard to say exactly where. Sexism appears to be pervasive and possibly worse in the tech culture. Then again, differences in interests seem to be stable and start even in elementary school. Alternatively, there are findings that might just change how people see the whole issue. For example, compared to men, women may do just as well on math, but also have relatively higher verbal abilities. Consequently, they have more choices and might just choose something else, while men have fewer options. I recommend you check out some of the links in the show notes at trcpodcast.com to explore this further.
The word interest is an interesting one.
Yes, indeed.
Right, because it almost carries with it leaning towards one of those two options that you've given at the end, like nature versus nurture, right? So to suggest that it's interest makes it almost sound as though it is nature, in my mind anyways. And I think that may be part of what sets the concerns off, or the dialogue off, is that it seems to almost be leaning towards one by the very nature of the language used.
And that's interesting, because I imagine someone else would say, well, if you have more of a social constructionist model, people are socialized certain ways, their interests are malleable in that sense, so saying interest has nothing to do with biological inclination or determinism. I'm not sure how I feel about it anymore, because the more you look into it, you start to get at your own views of what interests mean. I could certainly see some of it being socialized and maybe underlying parts of it being genetic.
Well, I can add to that just because a woman may be interested in a certain field, they may be discouraged from going into that field because of sexism or other reasons that would put a bad taste in her mouth. So I think interest is an interesting word to me too, because exactly what that means, I'm sure that some of the people who said they did not have interest in pursuing something had something to do with the fact that they were either discouraged, deterred. There's something that completely turned them off. They may have been really interested in math or engineering in middle school or in high school, and then as they got older, they had a bad experience that maybe they turned off.
I guess that was my point, and Darren didn't really get into the why, but I guess my point was that for me, and maybe for others, the word interest almost sort of leans it towards the nature part of it. And Darren's comments noted that for me, and I think for some other people, maybe the very nature of the word interest suggests that it is not related to sexism or the nurture part of the world.
Yeah.
You'd almost have to do an empirical test of how people react to the word interests.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are other ways to gauge that kind of thing. You can study various cultures around the world, and if there are trends in different cultures that persist, then you can say there's more weight to someone being born with such an interest versus learning it, or you can look at children versus adults and things like that. And you'll never get a perfect answer, because you can't take 5,000 people and grow them on an island where they're all treated exactly the same, but it's probably going to be a mix, and it's where you draw that line seems to be something a lot of people disagree on.
I personally think medicine is the best medicine, and Christina's going to tell us why she thinks it's laughter.
Well, considering what's been going on in the world lately, Darren, and the increased stress and anxiety people seem to be feeling as a result, I think we could all use a few more laughs in our lives, can't we? We've often heard the expression that laughter is the best medicine, but is there any real science to back that up? Well, friends, you'll be happy to know there is some compelling research in the field that gives us all many excuses to seek out more LOLs in our lives. So there's quite a few articles and studies you can find on the interwebs on the topic, but Forbes published a great overview by science writer David DeSalvo just a couple of months ago, and it covers a few science-based reasons as to why laughter can be the best medicine. So let's dig into a couple that stood out to me and some of the studies backing them up. Laughter is a potent endorphin releaser, and laughter contagiously forms social bonds. Now, endorphins are those feel-good chemicals our brain releases. They activate the body's opiate receptors. One of the most recent studies on laughter focused on whether laughing with others releases endorphins in our brain. It was published in the Journal of Neuroscience in May of this year, so it's pretty recent. The authors of the study mentioned in their abstract that, quote, it has been proposed that endogenous opioid release following social laughter would provide a neurochemical pathway supporting long-term relationships in humans, yet this hypothesis currently lacks direct neurophysiological support. So they set out to see if they could substantiate this by using positron emission tomography, or PET. It's a test that uses a special type of camera and a tracer, i.e. a radioactive chemical, to look at organs in your body. Participants were scanned after spending 30 minutes alone in a testing room as a baseline, then again following a 30-minute social laughter session. They found that endogenous opioid release was stronger following laughter versus the baseline scan, and the more opioid receptors a person's brain has, the more powerful the effect was. Now, these are the same receptors that addictive opioid drugs like heroin bind to, and suggests laughter can have euphoric effects not unlike narcotics. This endorphin effect can also explain why social laughter is contagious. As DeSalvo describes, it's like a game of endorphin dominoes. If one person starts laughing, inevitably others will too, even if you don't really know why you're laughing.
Except it's more fun than dominoes.
True. The study's authors concluded that modulation of the opioidergic activity by social laughter may be an important neurochemical mechanism reinforcing and maintaining social bonds between humans. Laughter has an effect similar to antidepressants. Now, we all probably know someone who suffers from depression. Depression is a medical condition with emotional and behavioral, cognitive, and physical symptoms, where something is not quite right in the mood control circuit of the brain. Neurotransmitters in the brain of people who suffer from depression, such as norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, are reduced, but laughter seems to activate the release of serotonin, the same chemical that is affected by most common types of antidepressants called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This means laughter can alter dopamine and serotonin activity. The Journal of Korean Academy of Nursing published a study in 2015 that looked at how laughter therapy impacts serotonin levels, quality of life, and depression in middle-aged women. The results showed that serotonin activation through laughter therapy did help control or lessen depression. Although the research wasn't clear about how long the effect lasted, it did show that laughing triggers a pretty potent burst of brain activity for at least a short period of time. Finally, laughter is good for your heart. Laughter seems to have an anti-inflammatory effect that protects heart muscles and blood vessels from the damaging effects of cardiovascular disease. A study by cardiologists at the University of Maryland Medical Center has shown that laughter, along with an active sense of humor, may help protect us against heart attacks. The study was presented at the American Heart Association's 73rd Scientific Sessions and is the first study to really show that laughter may help prevent heart disease. Says Dr. Michael Miller, an associate professor and director of the Center for Preventive Cardiology at the university, quote, the old saying that laughter is the best medicine definitely appears to be true when it comes to protecting your heart. We don't know yet why laughing protects the heart, but we know that mental stress is associated with impairment of the endothelium, the protective barrier lining our blood vessels. This can cause a series of inflammatory reactions that lead to fat and cholesterol buildup in the coronary arteries and ultimately to a heart attack. Miller suggests that perhaps hearty laughter should be added to the list alongside the usual advice given to reduce the risk of heart disease, like regular exercise, healthy diet, and not smoking.
So I think he makes a good soundbite, but the first sentence is preposterous to me. It's like, it really is the best medicine, and exercise, and eating well.
Sure.
Well, maybe those are more important.
And statins and other
Right, and then also
medication.
Avoiding stress is not quite the same as positively laughing. And then also I was thinking, did they really do twin studies where they had someone genetically similar in a similar environment but told one not to laugh and the other one did laugh, and then they looked at their heart outcomes in 20, 30, 50 years later?
Or you compare twins. Yeah.
Well, obviously we have to take the saying, laughter is the best medicine with a grain of salt. The point is
Well, salt might not be good for your heart. I feel like there's conflicting messages here.
Now, there is a dark side of laughter, and I linked to an interesting Scientific American article from May that covers why some laughter isn't always positive or healthy. A well-documented syndrome known as pseudobulbar effect syndrome is characterized by uncontrollable outbursts of laughing or crying at odds with how a person is feeling. So a quick example might be if you're told someone has died and your reaction is to laugh. It's commonly associated with traumatic brain injuries and neurological conditions like MS, ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. A study published in the Journal of Alzheimer's by the University College London in 2016, for instance, found that an increasingly twisted sense of humor, including laughing at inappropriate times like in the middle of a funeral, could be an early sign of dementia. So, checkers and esteemed co-hosts, I have one last question for you. Why are quantum physicists so bad at sex?
They can tell you where things are, but not where they're going.
It's a pretty good try. Because when they find the position, they can't find the momentum, and when they have the momentum, they can't find the position.
Nailed it, or rather didn't.
Yeah, and before any quantum physicists send me any hate mail, note that this is what we in the biz call a joke.
The joke biz.
I hope we're in the universe that doesn't get any emails about that.
Thanks, Cristina. And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. Pat told us that glyphosate is in our food, but it's really not much to worry about unless you're having tons of it. Again, poison is in the dose. I looked into the average female and male interest and whether they differ, and indeed they do. But don't use that to treat individuals differently. And Cristina told us that laughter may not be actually the best medicine, but is good for us in numerous ways. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes
Are actually marked with an asterisk. Asterisk. Asterix and Obelix has blown my ability to say the word asterisk.
That's why
that's more than fair.
It never sounds
I've
right.
lost a couple words that I used to know automatically in English.
Another issue is that many of the results they reported are actually marked with an asterisk. The asterisk, oh boy. The asterisk denotes that the asterisk, here we go, I got the outtakes now.
Yep, Vint Cerf.
The asterisk